Thank you, Carlos, and thank you everyone for joining our event today. As Carlos mentioned, that I'm currently serving as the director of the China Asia program, and I'm also currently teaching two courses at IWP on North Korea's nuclear and WMD capabilities, as well as North Korean espionage. So the IWP's China Asia program was launched back in September 2022. It is a new academic initiative encompassing academic courses, lectures, and research about Asia, specifically focused on China, Taiwan, and North Korea. One of the program's long term goals is to establish partnerships with other academic institutions in the US, as well as allied countries in the Northeast Asia region. Through these partnerships, IWP will invite international students from the allied countries to participate in IWP's master's and doctoral programs and provide IWP students with study abroad opportunities in said region, including the Republic of Korea, Japan, in addition to Taiwan, which will be launched in May this year. Today's event is part of the China Asia program's Asia Initiative lecture series, which I founded back in 2019. And we have Dr. Bruce Bennett, who will discuss addressing the evolving security challenges in Korea. Dr. Bennett is a senior international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He's an expert in Northeast Asian security issues, having visited the region over 125 times and written much about Korean security. His research addresses issues such as the North Korean military threats, countering the North Korean nuclear threat and provocations, future Republic of Korea's military force requirements, Korean unification, the Korean military balance, and potential Chinese military intervention in North Korea. Dr. Bennett specializes in asymmetric threats, such as weapons of mass destruction, and how to counter those threats with new strategies, operational concepts, and technologies. He has recently completed reports on the current North Korean nuclear, chemical, biological, and cyber threats and teaches a class at the Party Rand Graduate School on understanding nuclear forces. He has worked with the Pentagon and with U.S. commanders in Northeast Asia and the Persian Gulf on these subjects. He has facilitated a large number of seminars, war games to address these issues. Dr. Bennett received a PhD in policy analysis from their Party Rand Graduate School and a BS in economics from the California Institute of Technology. Well, Dr. Bruce Bennett, thank you so much for having us today, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Amanda. My pleasure, and I hope we have the technology working now. So let's give it a try. As Amanda said, I'm going to talk about addressing the evolving security challenges in Korea. So let me advance to my first slide. I'm going to talk about four specific kinds of issues now: North Korean instability, their nuclear weapons, third-party intervention, and the concerns about the South Korean Army, the ROK, or Republic of Korea Army, becoming too small. So let me proceed right away to instability. We have to recognize that the North Korean economy is not doing well. With Russian financing, it's doing a little better, but it still has many problems. Markets being important elements that Kim is trying to suppress in some ways. Its industry is largely dilapidated. Its agriculture is not doing all that well. They still have problems with COVID, apparently. They're involved in extensive purges of people. And if you compare South Korea and North Korea, it's pretty clear who the major power is and who the third world country is. Nevertheless, Kim Jong-un has turned to weapons, and in particular his nuclear weapons, as being symbolic of his empowerment. That said, he views outside information as a major threat to his regime. He's even called K-pop a vicious cancer that could cause his regime to collapse. So this is a concern from the North Korean perspective. The nuclear weapons are his major success. Now, from my perspective, I look at North Korea having three main objectives: regime survival, domination of the peninsula, and making the regime a regional great power. Now, many people will say, wait a minute, he just gave up on Korean unification. Well, yes and no. He gave up on a negotiation to lead to unification, but he certainly did not give up on conquest of the South and North Korean absorption of the South, and has explicitly stated that. Nevertheless, that may not be his path of priority. Now, he's got nuclear weapons and he's built them to facilitate these objectives, and he uses them both with his internal audience and his external audience. The bottom line is US, South Korean hopes that North Korea would denuclearize, probably not possible because nuclear weapons are such a core aspect of his regime. So let me turn to the nuclear weapons in particular without entirely neglecting chemical and biological weapons, which are also important. Let me note here that North Korea has carried out 6 nuclear weapon tests. The dates are given here, the approximate weapon yields given. And if those were used against targets in Seoul, in Manhattan, or in Beijing, this gives you a rough estimate of the number of fatalities and serious injuries that would occur. Now, by serious injuries, I'm not just talking about glass cuts from shattered windows. These are people who would get sick with radiation poisoning or similar serious illnesses. That was from a single nuclear weapon. If we take a look at his overall inventory here, what we see is different estimates of what the numbers are. The academic track tends to be a lower set of estimates. There's a higher set of estimates that RAND in particular has participated in. We don't know for sure what his production capability is, but it looks like it could be pretty significant. And that's a concern because even with a few nuclear weapons, he could cause great damage. Now, the U.S. national intelligence community puts out national intelligence estimates, NIEs. They published an extract openly last year saying, so why does North Korea have nuclear weapons? Fundamentally, if you look at on this slide, the upper right, it talks about the likelihood that Kim will focus on each of these scenarios. And the bottom line is it doesn't look like he's pursuing just defensive use or even just offensive use. It looks like his key focus is on coercive use. With that in mind, we have to ask, okay, how's he going to coerce? The academic literature talks about a phenomenon called the nuclear shadow. Once a country has nuclear weapons, other countries are often reluctant to retaliate against it once it carries out provocations or even limited attacks. Kim looks like he's looking in this direction. He might still consider an offensive invasion of South Korea, which I just mentioned he's talking about if the regime is failing, remembering that for the Kim family, it's not German unification that's the key fear. It's the Romanian overthrow in 1989 of the Ceausescu regime by the military. That's the thing which the Kim regime seems to be most worried about. And we have to ask against these different potential threats, will U.S. declaratory policy work? So let's look at that in a little more detail. We can look at an example from 2010 when out of 2019, there were missile tests. The US or the South Koreans sank a North Korean patrol boat in late 2019, and the North Koreans sank the rock ship Chonan. They shelled Yeonpyeong Island, and there was counter battery shelling. That means that the South Koreans fired artillery back, though they didn't have much available to use. But they did not escalate beyond that because they were concerned that if they did, it could lead to an escalation spiral to major war. So historically, even before the major nuclear weapon threat, South Korea and the US were concerned about an escalation spiral, if they went too far in responding to North Korean limited attacks. The problem, of course, now is that North Korea has nuclear weapons. Everyone is going to be concerned about the possibility that any kind of escalation could spiral up to limited nuclear conflicts, and Kim has been threatening exactly such things. If you compare what Putin has been threatening to what Kim is threatening, where he openly talks about the annihilation of South Korea, if you're North Korea, you don't annihilate South Korea with the North Korean army. You could with a bunch of nuclear weapons. The bottom line is the US has threatened North Korea as our declaratory policy that if the regime uses nuclear weapons, it will not survive if it does so. The question, of course, is, does the regime believe that? Apparently in part, but will it try and test that? So let me illustrate that point. This is showing a picture of downtown Pyongyang. The red arrow in the picture is pointing to the offices of Kim Jong-un. His offices are about 150 meters by 120 meters in size. If we targeted the regime with conventional weapons in response to a North Korean nuclear weapon use, you're not going to destroy even this facility, let alone the 30 to 40 palaces that Kim has around the country and other places he could be located. So you think about, okay, well, then if we're going to go after this location, we'd potentially have to use nuclear weapons. But if we use one of the smallest US nuclear weapons currently available, the 8 kiloton Trident warhead, used against this facility, there would be an estimated 76,000 people killed and 140,000 seriously injured. That's a lot of people. The 5 psi ring tells you the buildings that would essentially be destroyed, at least for any wood frame buildings, but even others potentially. 500 rem, if people are outside, that's enough radiation to kill about half of the people who would be directly exposed. So this is a big deal if we use even a small nuclear weapon to respond to Kim and try to take out the regime. If we use our more standard nuclear weapons, the numbers are much higher. And the question is, if Kim has detonated a nuclear weapon on a single target in South Korea, would an American president respond with these kinds of responses, given that Kim could then escalate and attack potentially American cities, but certainly major South Korean cities and cause extensive damage? Now, to understand a little bit more about this, think about the major South Korean targets that Kim could target in a conflict. This shows the airfields. The green stars are the command control facilities, the major ones. The blue is the ports, the major ports in South Korea. And if we targeted one of those airfields down at Daegu, for example, or if North Korea targeted it, its 6th nuclear test was reportedly by some authorities 230 kilotons, and that is enough to destroy most, not only wood frame buildings, but concrete buildings that would be in the area of the airfield. It would basically decimate the airfield. It would also deliver 500 rem radiation poisoning to anybody not shielded. And the other buildings out to 5 psi, the red circle there, extensive damage out in the Daegu area. Daegu's unfortunate. The city has grown up around the airfield that used to be at the edge of the city. Meanwhile, a 20 kiloton nuclear weapon doesn't destroy the airfield. It causes a lot of damage, but it destroys a much smaller part of the airfield with 20 psi. Now, Kim has said that he plans to use tactical nuclear weapons against airfields in South Korea. He said it explicitly. But you have to wonder, is he really talking about a 10 or 20 kiloton weapon, roughly the size of the weapons U.S. used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II? Or is he talking about something much bigger? My guess is if he really wants to destroy those facilities, it's much bigger. Let me turn then to third-party intervention. People have looked at the Chinese military change in organization several years ago. And if you notice it, you notice that what used to be the Shenyang military region that was directly north of North Korea was joined by areas to the west of North Korea. Now the Northern Theater, the area in red there, allows advances against North Korea in two directions. And North Korea's noticed that China could indeed take action against the North. Why would third parties want to intervene? Well, for China and Russia, they've got a variety of reasons, including wanting to stop refugees, wanting to control the situation, demonstrating their great power status. In addition, you add Japan, and North Korea could well be shooting missiles at those countries. You know, it's the case that North Korean missiles don't just travel southbound. They can go east, they can go north, they can go west. Japan is worried about that, but China and Russia probably also worry about that. And if we look at much broader countries potentially wanting to intervene, there's a huge non-combatant evacuation issue in South Korea if North Korea starts using nuclear weapons in particular. How serious? I'll show you in a minute. Meanwhile, if you look at Chinese intervention into North Korea, there's been a lot of discussion that China could come into a 50-kilometer buffer or a 100-kilometer buffer to stop refugee flows into China. From the late 90s, when there was the famine in North Korea, it was clear that there was great concern about refugees flowing into China. Some reports as much as 1 million. That area of China is the part of China with the poorest economy. Chinese don't want a whole lot of North Koreans flooding in. So if they decide to advance, they may well come down to the narrow neck, which is a much more defensible area if they also expect South Korea to be and the US to be advancing into the north, or even down as far as the Nampo-Wonsan line, which some Chinese authorities have talked about as the objective of their advance. The problem, of course, is if China moves into those areas, is it prepared to ever pull out, or will it stay there? And certainly if it does pull out, it's dependent upon South Korea and the US being prepared to stabilize the area once it pulls out. And that we'll discuss in a little bit. I mentioned non-combatant evacuation as a key issue. This shows the number of foreign residents in South Korea according to the South Korean Immigration Service in 2019 and in 2022. The pandemic caused these numbers to go down significantly for many countries, but there's still over 2 million foreign citizens living in Japan or living in South Korea. You can see the numbers here, many different countries in the world. And those countries, if there's nuclear weapons used in the South, are going to want to evacuate. China in particular, they'll probably approach South Korea and say, look, we only need 3 or 4 of your airfields, 2 or 3 of your major ports to pull our people out. That doesn't help South Korea and the US fight a war against North Korea. All right, I mentioned the South Korean army becoming too small. The blue line shows the decline in the size of the South Korean active duty army. It was back around 2005, around 550,000 active duty personnel. As of the 2022 defense white paper, The Army was down to 365,000. The Defense Ministry in South Korea believes, shown in the black dash line there, that they can maintain it at that level. But looking at the demographics suggests to me that the numbers could be considerably lower in the future as the size of the age cohort turning draft age continues to decline. And that's a major concern for the next several years that South Korea is likely going to experience. Problem with that is, even where they are now with an army of 365,000, you've got a North Korean army of reportedly 1.1 million. How do they go into the north and stabilize it? And if that stabilization is contingent upon a Chinese withdrawal from areas they advance into North Korea, how do you pull that off? Well, a lot of people will say, well, South Korea has lots of reservists. Those reservists train 3 days a year. That does not build unit cohesion, which is absolutely required in stabilization. When the U.S. mobilized its reserves to go forward for mobilization, not only did those reserves train 35 or so days a year, but they also received extensive training before they were deployed to the Middle East. All right, so how do we manage the ROC manpower reductions? Well, demographics are a major source, but also politics. South Korea cut its draft period from 24 months down to 18 months. Part of that was done over 10 years ago, but the rest of it was done under the last presidential administration. It cut roughly 50,000 soldiers out of the ROC Army. That's a major cut. The Defense Ministry is planned in 2005. They knew they were going to go through the demographic problem. They planned for 15 years to spend over 600 trillion won on the Ministry of National Defense to do a manpower versus technology trade-off. When they got to 2020, they spent 100 trillion won less, largely a loss of the technology, advanced weapon systems. You can buy a lot of advanced weapons for 100 trillion won. And of course, the problem, as I mentioned, is your reserve forces are just not a great alternative to active duty forces. So we've got a variety of security challenges. We have to ask, what is the objective? Is the objective in wartime the absorption of North Korea or simply resolving the threat? In peacetime, is it minimizing the threat growth, minimizing provocations? What do we do about the North Korean nuclear weapons, especially since they're building nuclear weapons? And I don't see very much that's going on in South Korea and the US to deter that development and growth. So if we refocus our thinking about deterrence, we need at this stage to move away from negotiating for denuclearization. Denuclearization is not going to solve the problem. We need to instead turn to trying to deter North Korea. In the May 2022 U.S. ROC Summit, it was said solid deterrence against North Korea is more important than anything else. So how do you get deterrence? Well, deterrence is a trade-off, trying to deny the benefits that North Korea seeks and threatening costs against North Korea. I mentioned earlier the cost we threaten against North Korean nuclear weapon use is the destruction of the regime, but it's usually more effective to deny benefits. Denying benefits can be done by being able to defeat North Korean attacks. The costs, well, there are a variety of measures in what we call DIME that I'll turn to shortly. So how do we deny North Korean attacks? These are the stages through which North Korea would move to use nuclear weapons against South Korea. From the weapons, the command control, delivery of the weapons, and their effects. Much of our focus is on things like missile defense. That is a denial capability. To the extent that our missile defense can destroy North Korean missiles inbound, that's effective. Now, North Korea has been carrying out major propaganda efforts to say North Korea has hypersonic missiles that we can't intercept. It's got maneuverable missiles that we can't intercept. Well, the US and Iraq ought to be saying more about what's going on in Ukraine. Patriot missiles, which are in South Korea, similar Patriot missiles are in Ukraine. They're shooting down hypersonic missiles. They're shooting down maneuverable missiles. So South Korea and the US actually have better capability, and North Korea is creating a scare. We need to do a better job of helping the South Korean people see we can really defend ourselves pretty well. Now, we could turn to the effects of nuclear weapons and build shelters and build airfields for dispersal of aircraft. That doesn't help deterrence usually very much, and probably not the cost-effective approach. The other approach, which South Korea has moved to very seriously with its kill chain and its three-axis system, follows up on what the US threat is of any nuclear attack will result in the end of that regime. But to carry that out, we need to know where the regime is, where its weapons are, and we've got to have the capability to strike those things. We're working that. South Korea has a major effort ongoing. The US is working on that. That's a key area that's got to be pursued. DIME is an acronym for the four key ways of responding to an adversary: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. The US and South Korea have heavily focused on diplomacy, but we're now saying, well, we're trying to get North Korea to the negotiating table, but we can't get them, so what can we do about diplomacy? I'd argue that's a lame excuse. I mean, the reality is we can put offers on the table for North Korea. Outside information leaks into North Korea. Let's let his elites know what the offers are we're prepared to make. We can do some degree of diplomacy. It's not perfect, but we can start it. Information, if there's anything that scares Kim Jong-un, it appears to be information. We ought to be using that more. Even with the military, there are other things we could be doing, and even with economics, there are more things we could be doing. So let me give you an example. We could say that we're prepared to offer an agreement where we will provide humanitarian assistance, more food, vaccines, medical care. Think of the things North Korea misses: electrical power, medical care, food. We could help provide those things. We could offer education to North Korean elites. I've talked to many individuals who escaped North Korea. We usually call them defectors. I prefer to call them escapees. Their families, for the elite members among them, would have given almost anything to let their kids come to Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, so forth. We could offer that kind of education opportunity. We could offer selective relaxation of the sanctions. But then we have to ask, what do we get North Korea to do? And I'll turn to that. Meanwhile, we've got to get clear that if Kim doesn't negotiate, we're prepared to provide outside information, which is not going to help him with his key audiences. You know, for example, Kim Jong-un's trying to use missile launches and other tests, provocations in order to help break the ROK-US alliance. Why isn't the US and South Korea responding? Thank you, Kim Jong-un, for making the alliance stronger. And boy, who would have guessed that we would see a trilateral partnership between Korea, Japan, and the US? Kim Jong-un, you are heavily responsible, your provocations, for accomplishing that. I don't think Kim Jong-un's elites would think a lot of him if we were making that point. The other thing we've got to think about, this is an ancient statement, If you want peace, prepare for war. If we want to convince North Korea not to make limited attacks, we've got to convince them that we're prepared to stop those limited attacks, again, by being able to deny them. Let's not just threaten retaliation. Let's be able to demonstrate we can prevent their attacks. In terms of information, I said we ought to use that as a stick with Kim. He said K-pop is a vicious cancer that could cause the regime to crumble like a damp wall. What's more scary to Kim Jong-un than the regime crumbling like a damp wall? So we ought to be saying more about, in South Korea, the plentiful food, livable wage, even for government workers. The North Korean wage for government workers is hardly livable. The rule of law, what are the advantages of having that as the nature of your society? What about North Korean human rights abuses? Shouldn't human rights be core to our interacting with North Korea, sending information into the North? And then Kim constantly complains about US hostility. But I got to ask, let's take the words said by President Biden and by Kim Jong-un. Who's more hostile? It's pretty clear to me that Kim Jong-un is far more hostile. One of the things Kim and some American supporters have been pushing for is a peace treaty. Well, let's get a real peace treaty. Let's say that if we're going to have peace, North Korea shouldn't be doing anti-US indoctrinations, and they should keep only a defensive level of nuclear weapons. Let's not just make a peace treaty a US set of compromises. Let's get North Korea to agree to create the conditions for peace. In conclusion, we have to recognize that North Korean nuclear weapons are very dangerous. One or two detonated in South Korea could be a major problem. Now, it could cause severe disruptions of the economy, the people, and so forth. That's a problem. We should expect third-party intervention and be prepared to manage it. And we've got to revisit our strategy. We need to use much more in the way of information. If that's the weapon that Kim is most afraid of, that's where we got leverage. And I'll turn to questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bennett. It was such an insightful lecture. And before we open up the Q&A session to the audience, I actually want to give you one question. So
Sure.
I agree with you that Kim Jong Un actually didn't give up on unification. Rather, we can interpret it as Kim Jong Un being more radical and hostile. Kim Jong Un may, at some point invade the South again. And while Kim Jong Un is going definitely more irrational, Xi Jinping also made an announcement that by 2027, China wants to unify, mainland China and Taiwan. So between the two, between those two threats, which threat do you think is more imminent? Kim Jong Un attacking the South again, or Xi Jinping literally invading Taiwan?
I of the opinion that Kim does not want to invade South Korea. We talk about it in the academic literature as his soldiers going into South Korea would suffer severe ideological contamination.
Mm-hmm.
If you think the leakage of K-pop into the North is bad now, wait till his soldiers are down in the South, picking up, hearing the songs, seeing the Korean dramas, sending that kind of material home, singing it over the North Korean cell phones to their families. And remember, many of the soldiers who would participate in an attack on South Korea are from elite families, because the North Koreans aren't going to treat the hostile people in North Korea as the core of their army. So, we ought to be looking at our opportunities to work with that. That said, I still think Kim Jong-un is prepared to invade the South. First of all, if you got an army of 1 million men, you don't tell them to go and start planting crops, and that's it. You got to keep them training for military purposes. You got to keep them doing that kind of thing. But I think for Kim, his concern is someday his military, like the Romanian military in 1989, might rise up against him. If he sees that coming, that's the time I believe he would order an invasion of the South. Because if his soldiers are headed south, they're not headed north to Pyongyang. And most of his key troops are south of Pyongyang. So I think that's still a possibility. So relative to your question, the question is Kim going to see serious internal problems before 2027? And I think the answer to that is he's already seeing some. I mean, we get a variety of indications that he's got some pretty significant internal problems. Russia's help is helping to alleviate some of the food problems, but not a lot of other things. So it may be event driven rather than time driven in terms of when we need to be concerned here. And China may decide that 2027 is not the perfect time to invade Taiwan. They may try to do that later while working politically, as they are heavily now, to control Taiwan.
Thank you. We'll start taking questions. The first question is, given Pyongyang's strong control over information entering North Korea, how should the U.S. ROK get information to the North Korean people? As an example, balloons, loudspeakers, radio, etc.
The answer is yes, all of the above, but in the appropriate circumstances. For example, I wrote an op-ed a year or so ago in which I said, let's tell Kim Jong-un, if you do a seventh nuclear test, we're going to put 1 million USB drives with K-pop, K-dramas, and so forth into Pyongyang. Put them in on drones, put them in on balloons, and so forth. And we know your security forces will collect up 95% of those. And we still think 50,000 USBs with that kind of material among your elites will drive you crazy. So that's an example of one thing we could do. Remember the defector who defected across the border at Panmunjom not long ago? And he was singing South Korean songs and wanted to, here's a soldier in the military, and yet he had heard lots of the K-pop music. That was the first thing he asked for when he finally woke up from all his injuries. Things leak in. Yes, Kim is trying to prevent it, trying vigorously to prevent it. But we can send information in a variety of ways. There was a 2004 agreement between South Korea and North Korea not to do that kind of information operation. But step back. Every day since 2004, North Korea has been doing information operation against South Korea. So why is South Korea honoring that agreement when Kim hasn't for decades now?
Thank you. And the next question is, how do you see the recent improvement in ROK-Japanese relations as influencing the peninsula's strategic climate?
Well, I think what that does is it provides a number of helpful things. Remember, I talked about denial, being able to prevent North Korean attacks being important. So let me give you an example. If North Korea launches a ballistic missile towards South Korea, if all you're doing is looking up towards the missile coming at you, you don't get all that accurate a position count with your radars. But if you have radars in Japan that are looking at it at the side, you get much more accuracy in terms of combining those two things in order to be able to intercept the missile as it maneuvers, especially. So that cooperation, I mean, right now, Japan and South Korea are sharing that kind of information. That strengthens the defense of South Korea. Or if North Korea sends a missile at Japan, well, you get the same thing turned on the side. So it strengthens the defense of both countries. It also has got to be awfully discouraging to Kim, who's worried that his people are going to find out that because of the action he took, he managed to there was a partnership that developed. So, I think there are various elements of that.
Thank you. And again, if you have any questions, please type in your question in the Q&A chat box. And while our attendees upload their uh, questions, let me see, Q&A. Okay, we got one more question just now. Says, you mentioned medical and educational engagement and leads children studying at Harvard, etc. Do you think bringing small numbers out to the US or elsewhere uh, is best? Or in-country works such medical/hospital projects until now by NGOs and the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology or the British Council's English teacher training program. In-country works would engage with much larger numbers of students and trainees.
I think the answer is all of the above. I mean, what we're trying to do, Kim has created this view of the outside world that is highly hostile. We need to do everything we can, both with people going in for medical purposes, for educational purposes, for bringing North Korean elites out. I mean, my sense of the academic programming we carry out is we'd say, we want 50 North Koreans to come to graduate school programs at major universities in the US. Now, if they don't speak English, they're not going to be able to do that. They can't go to a graduate school program at Harvard and make it feasible. So who's going to speak English in North Korea? Well, heavily the families of the senior elites. So by making that kind of invitation, you're actually tapping into the senior elite families. And the feedback is going to go to those families. Now, Kim may decide when those people go back to North Korea that he's got to throw them into gulags for some period of time. That would be unfortunate. But meanwhile, there's going to be information that gets back in from them. I mean, we seem to think that North Korea's kind of got this Berlin Wall surrounding it to prevent information from coming in. Why do you think Kim is closing embassies around the world? Because the personnel in those embassies are a key way of getting information into North Korea. And he doesn't want that. So he's closing a lot of embassies that were making money for him, which he also needs. But he's more concerned about the information leakage, apparently, than about the money.
Thank you. And we got a couple more questions. The next question is the human trafficking and exploitation of North Korean citizens by PLA personnel and the illicit fishing activities of PRC fleets a significant enough wedge to drive between North Korea and the PRC?
Well, the problem, of course, is that I don't think people in North Korea are being told about it. In particular, the military needs to know more about what's going on. So I think this is another case of information operations. I talked about sending USB drives into Pyongyang. My USB drives that I would send in, 90 to 95% would be K-pop and K-dramas, and the other 5 to 10% would be selected messages. Did you know that there's human trafficking going on by China with North Korean people? Did you know that there's illegal fishing going on by China? I mean, we need to create an understanding of those people. We ought to be doing it. I mean, you've got North Koreans who are apparently in Russia as observers near Ukraine with the North Korean weapons being used. Why aren't we carrying on a major information operation in Korean out of Ukraine? And maybe we are, but we should be, because there are people there who will hear and potentially bring influence back to the North. And Kim's not going to send a hostile kid to Russia to observe things going on in Ukraine. It's going to be somebody from a senior elite family. Perfect. Let's reach those people who could make a difference. So I think, and if you're talking about Kim Il-sung University, any of the other major universities in North Korea, most of the people going there are from the uh, top Songbun categories, political um, the political rating system in the North. We ought to be certainly trying to reach out to those people and letting them know we don't hate them. We're happy to help them under certain conditions where they don't threaten us.
Thank you. And the next question is, you mentioned that the focus should be deterrence as opposed to denuclearization. Can Japan and RK give up long-held objective of denuclearizing North Korea?
I think what we have to state is denuclearization is still a long-term objective, but it's not something that's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. So, do I want to see North Korea denuclearized? Absolutely not a question. But if that's our short-term focus, and we're waiting for the North to say, yeah, come on up and negotiate, we're ready to negotiate with you and giving up our nuclear weapons, not going to happen. We have to be realistic about what it is that can be negotiated. And yes, absolutely, long term, I want those weapons gone from the North. And I don't want those weapons in South Korea for the current purposes. Um, I think, though, that what we should be looking at is we need shorter term objectives. If you try to bite an entire cow for dinner, um, you're going to die. If you bite a quarter-pound hamburger, good, you got it. It's a great meal. So we have to take bite-sized pieces and work on solving those and building some degree of trust in the process.
Thank you. And the next question is, a lot of DC conversations have focused on North Korea taking advantage of China invading Taiwan. Is it fair to say that Dr. Bennett believes North Korean instability may preclude a Chinese invasion rather than result from it?
Um, I think we have to remember what Xi Jinping has said. He said he will not allow war or chaos on the Korean Peninsula. Now, if the Korean Peninsula has chaos, has war, demonstrations, whatever, I think China's shown every capability to be able to send some troops into North Korea. A combination of their security forces and their regular army. So I think they are prepared to do that. They would prefer not to do that. They'd like to see stability in the North. If they do that, because instability develops in the North, that doesn't necessarily preclude them proceeding with Taiwan. It's different forces that are facing Taiwan. Could China manage a two-front war? Well, that'd be kind of hard. They had trouble with a one-front war against Vietnam years and years ago, but nevertheless, they might be able to, and that might be something they try. If China does go into Taiwan militarily, would Kim Jong-un consider that to be a time to invade the South? Well, it depends upon his internal circumstances. If things are relatively stable, why take the risk of outside information? But if things are relatively unstable, then yeah, maybe that's the time to do it. It's certainly the most advantageous. What we have to remember is that's a condition-based situation, and we need to be thinking about what we can do to help try and manage that.
Thank you. Due to the limited time, we'll just take two more questions. The next question is, assuming a major power like Russia or China does enter North Korea during a conflict, how do you think Kim would respond? What could the U.S. and its partners do to minimize any rash actions on North Korea's part?
Um, with regard to how do we minimize those actions, I think North Korea would see a Chinese crossing the border with major military forces to be just as threatening as a South Korean force crossing the demilitarized zone. Um, I think the same with Russia. I don't think they would view that favorably. Um, at RAND, we get U.S. Air Force officers out of the U.S. Air Force Academy who come to RAND's graduate school every year to get their PhDs before they go off for their operational assignments. I had a student who came to RAND 4.5 years ago, and her dissertation that I worked with her on as her chairman was on the North Korean nuclear threat to China. If there are people who are interested in our perspective on what North Korea might do if China tried to cross the border, I recommend you look at that dissertation. Her name is Diana Myers. She's an Air Force captain now serving at Osan Air Base in Korea. And you can look at RAND publications and look her up, or they could email me and I'd be happy to provide the reference.
Thank you. And the last question is, are there any metrics for frozen conflict like North Korea versus RK? Do you see any similarities slash signs of frozen conflict in terms of UKR versus RUS conflict?
I'm not sure what you were saying by frozen conflict.
Um, I don't
I,
see any further explanation, but how about whenever, as a North Korea slash China specialist at IWP, whenever I do have lectures on North Korea, I always ask this question before I conclude the event on, any event on North Korea. What do you think of the idea of regime change?
mm, ultimately, it has to happen. It's like denuclearization. Ultimately, it has to happen. The question is, don't we want to be prepared before we cross that bridge?
Hmm.
And how much are we doing now to prepare to cross
Hmm.
that bridge? Um, I don't see the kind of preparation I'd like to. South Korean army is now too small
Hmm.
to deal with a collapsed regime, um, to deal even with the refugee flow that would result from that kind of situation. But are we prepared to provide the food? Are we prepared to provide assistance if there's a replacement government? Do we know who those people are well enough to be able to establish relationships with them? Um, what do we do about law, for example? Are we going to throw everybody from the Korean Workers' Party into prison? Well, let's see. Gee, golly, that's, you know, several million people. South Korea has 50,000 prison spaces. So where are you
Hmm.
going to put several million people who you're claiming are enemies of the state? I mean, we need concepts like that because those elites who will be the ones who determine whether or not it's a peaceful result of the regime collapsing, unless they think that there's a future for them in a unification, it isn't going to happen. And if they're told that they're going to be thrown in prison, the chance of a peaceful unification after a collapse of the Kim regime is not high. So we need to be thinking about what is the end state we're anxious to achieve and how we get there.
I see. And we have only 1 minute. What do you think about, so like in Washington and of course in Seoul, there have been very controversial discussion regarding accepting North Korea as a nuclear state, given that North Korea is already a de facto nuclear state. What do you think about that?
What's Kim's number one objective with regard to nuclear weapons right now? Being recognized as a nuclear state. Why would we reward him for all of his bad behavior? So I mean, he's looking for that as a regime survival, regime strengthening measure. Um, I don't think we should give him that reward. I mean, Kim, if you decide to shut down all your uranium and plutonium production, stop making nuclear weapons, and start negotiating other factors, Sure, we could consider some things like that, but we're not, and we're not going to do that unless there's considerable compromise on your side. North Korea, Kim has said, I'm going to exponentially increase my nuclear weapon production. Anybody anxious for North Korea with 500 to 1,000 nuclear weapons? And is that 10 years off, 15 years off? Um, I hope to still be alive then. That's a world I don't want to see. So we need to start thinking about how we manage that process.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. It was such a insightful lecture, and hopefully in the future maybe you could give a lecture, as a guest speaker for one of my classes on North Korea. And thank you all for joining us today. Before I close up, I want to share one upcoming event. It'll be on April 15th. We are inviting U.S. Navy Admiral Phil Yu. He was a defense attaché to U.S. Embassy in Russia, and he'll be talking about Russia and Taiwan. And again, thank you for joining us today, and and I hope to see you again, Dr. Bennett.
Thank you. I look forward to it.